Now we're getting into the bit of the book of Revelation, which I think some people find, well, either the most attractive and intriguing and interesting, or on the other hand, the most kind of crazy and wild. And so we just need to proceed with a little bit of caution. And that's this is the area where we look at how Revelation uses numbers. And we need to just remember that we're following on from all the things we've said before. Revelation is, yes, it's a revelation, yes, it's prophetic, it's a letter, it's written to particular people in a particular time in a particular place. And actually these people understood numbers in a way that we might find strange. If I mention Pythagoras to you, I've no doubt you'll think back, possibly with dread or trauma, to your school-time mathematics, and you learned that Pythagoras' theorem was all about the relationship between the length of sides on a right-angled triangle. In fact, in his world, Pythagoras wasn't actually a mathematician in that sense. He was actually the leader of a magical cult. And the cult worshipped numbers because what they recognized is that numbers were strange and mysterious things. We don't really understand everything about how they work, but somehow or other, numbers control the world. That may be your feeling about mathematics yourself. I'm a mathematician, so I actually love maths, but a lot of people really loathe and detest it. But numbers continue to be really important in our world. In the first century, if you could conquer numbers, then you could conquer the world. If you could, as the Romans did, know how to measure things accurately and how to make right angles, you could make your flat-pack fortress and carry it over and invade Britain and erect your fortress before the natives had realised it, and you were in charge. Numbers meant power, but they were mysterious. And they were particularly mysterious in the ancient world because, unlike us, they didn't have a separate number system. We have a Latin alphabet, but we have an Arabic number system because that originates in the 7th and 8th centuries. In the time the Revelation was written, they used letters for numbers. So there was all sorts of potential for doing interesting things with numbers, as we'll see in a moment. In fact, Revelation uses numbers in a whole range of different ways. And again, some ways which would be quite strange to us, but actually quite familiar to people in John's world, to the people that John was writing to, and to John himself. And one of the first and perhaps strangest ways, which you might never have noticed, is that John uses numbers by repeating words in the text a certain number of times. If you've read a novel over the summer and I said to you, how often did someone's name occur in the book, I don't suppose you'll have noticed, because by and large, when we read text, we don't go through counting the number of words. But of course, in the ancient world, texts were generally much shorter than the text that we tend to read. If you've read a novel over the summer, you'll have read 150,000 words, much longer than anything like the book of Revelation. But so texts were much shorter, but actually texts were very important in terms of the attention people paid to the detail. If I wanted to get a copy of the book of Revelation, I'd probably have to pay someone to do it for me. And of course, how do I know how much to pay him? Well, it depends on the number of words I'm asking this person to write. So I'd have gone through and I'd have counted up how many words there are. And as I've done that, I might well have counted up how many of a particular word. In fact, as we read through the text of Revelation, we find that mention of the 7 spirits comes 4 times. The word serpent in Revelation 12 comes 4 times. The phrase that we find in the worship scene of lightnings and rumblings and thunder occur 4 times. This is a natural number because, of course, there are 4 corners of the earth. We hear in Revelation 7 about the 4 winds that the angels are holding back. We read the word blessed 7 times. In chapter 14, there's language of judgment using a sickle. That comes 7 times as well. Lord God Almighty, the mention of Alpha and Omega and beginning and end. The word Christ in reference to Jesus comes 7 times. The language of testimony or witness to Jesus comes 7 times. 7 there is not so much a number of perfection or divinity, but a number of completeness, because the ancients believed there were 7 seas. We still talk about that. They believed there were 7 planets. There are 7 days of the week. So 7 stands for the whole of something. And so on. We find that the phrase inhabitants of the earth come 10 times. We find Jesus' name comes 14 times. And 14 is twice 7, and 2 is the number of witness. Now that all might sound a bit bamboozling and a bit strange. But again, remember that this is a book written to particular people. And the question is not in the first instance, does this make sense to me? The question is, does it make sense to them? And what sense would they have made of it? So that's one way that John uses numbers. There's a second way which is quite different. Now, one of which you will have noticed, which is that John does actually use particular numbers several times. So he talks in chapter 7 of the 144,000 who are made up from 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it doesn't take too much mathematical genius to work out that 144 is a square number and that 1,000 is a cube. Now, what we have to think a bit harder about is to work out the significance of that. And it draws on ideas from the Old Testament that a particular square place of worship signifies the God of Israel in distinction from the gods and the powers of the other nation. So, for example, the Holy of Holies in the temple was actually a perfect cube. That was the way God instructed the first temple to be built to Solomon, and that's the way the second temple was built as well. And actually, when we get to the very end of Revelation, the holy city is itself a cube. It's an enormous cube. It covers kind of a third of the area of Europe, but it is a cube. And of course, it doesn't make any literal sense. A city can't be as wide and high and as long. But this is to symbolize that this is like the Holy of Holies in the temple. This is the place where God's people dwell. But actually, at the end of creation, when God has restored all things, when God has made a new heavens and a new earth, God will be with them, and God will wipe every tear from his eye. And the place that God's people dwell is the same geographical place as the presence of God in the Holy of Holies, a place cut off from God's people in the Old Testament. Only the high priest could enter one day a week, one day of the year. But actually, because of Jesus' death, there's a place now that we can inhabit and we can enter. So that's the second way that Revelation uses number, actually using specific numbers to say specific things theologically about different aspects of the book. And of course, the last way Revelation uses numbers is perhaps the one that's attracted most attention. And this is at the end of chapter 13 verse 18, where, interestingly, John tells us to do something very specific. He tells us that if we have wisdom, we are to calculate, to work out, to add up the number of the beast. Now, a lot of people say, oh no, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't try and decode the book. It's not a code. Actually, John tells us to do exactly that. He commands us to do some sums, to do the math, as American friends would say, to work out the number of the beast. But the strange thing is, he tells us the answer, and the answer is 666. Now, what does that mean? Well, maybe John's alluding to a kind of a threefold imitation of the forces of evil, in a copycat example of trying to impersonate God. Maybe he's saying something about falling short. 6 is 1 short of 7, which is the number associated with God. Actually, he's doing something else, something quite specific. He says that the number of the beast is the number of a man's name, and that number is 666. And through history, people have speculated, well, what person is this? What name would add up to that number? And again, we need to remember John is writing to people in the first century, and they knew how to add up someone's name to make up a number. You see, if each letter of the alphabet stands for a number, then every person's name has a number. It's a number you get simply by adding up the value of the letters in their name. And if you take someone who was the arch persecutor, the emperor who gave the Christians the hardest time, the Emperor Nero, if you take his name and you take his title, Caesar Nero, and you do it in a way that we know from inscriptions he did with an N on the end, you add that up, it actually comes to 666. I'm not going to explain to you now on video how to do that. That would be too complex, but you can read my Grow booklet and you can do the sums for yourself. And in fact, when you take the word the beast in the text and you do the same thing, you get the same number. John is telling something that actually his readers in a sense already know. He's saying, look, you may have been tempted to think that the power of the emperor is a power for good. You may have swallowed the propaganda that the Roman Empire is the place of peace and prosperity, Pax Romana. You may have been told, just bow down to the emperor, don't give any trouble, and you'll live life peacefully. Actually, what John is saying is that the truth behind imperial power, the truth behind this system of domination actually is going to cause trouble for you, because this is a system which claims to do for you what only God can do. And if you simply bow down, you're going to get into trouble. You're going to get into trouble in your lives, and you're going to get into trouble in your faith, because actually this person is someone who's claiming to be a rival to the true God. If you want to be faithful, in the same way that Jesus was a faithful witness to the Father, and you want to be a faithful witness to him, you're actually going to have to make a decision. Where does your allegiance lie? And that's how John is using this number. And of course, it's a pertinent question for us. It's not that we have the beast roaming our lands. It's not that we've got another Nero. But actually what we do have is we do have people who claim to be rivals to God. We have systems of power and domination which claim to offer us prosperity. If only we'll bow down, if only we'll conform, if only we won't ask too many questions and rock the boat, and try and be a good Christian, but try and bow down to the powers in our world as well. And I think God is saying to us through Revelation the same thing that John was saying to his generation. Actually, you can't compromise like that. You've got to make a decision. Are you going to stand up and be a faithful witness just as Jesus was?